Thanks very much for the introduction and welcoming you here and inviting me here, Ken and Ann as well. I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk about this work. It's been work that I've been engaged in for a number of years, working first with a national organization that works on issues of race and equity in a sort of networked improvement community way with multiple school districts trying to learn from each other and conduct research together. And so part of the effort here is to think about that work in the context of what it means for what we do in teacher education and leadership preparation and in our schools in the contemporary context. So I want to start out talking a little bit about my practical and intellectual motivations, give you sort of an overview of the theoretical tools that I'll use in talking about the work, and then spend some time unpacking organizational routines and their implications for racial disparities in educational outcomes. And I want to spend time talking about organizational routines because this becomes part of the foundation of how we think about deconstructing those routines. Once we've done that sort of careful analysis of the routines, it allows us to get inside of them and understand how inequality gets reproduced, even in the context of places where people have the best intentions, right? I'll talk a little bit about some work that I'm doing in Madison related to this. At UW, I have formed a partnership with the Madison Public Schools. And then I'll conclude, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion so we can engage with each other and further the conversation. So first of all, the practical implications. One of the things that brought me into the work that I'm doing is trying to understand this issue of differences in the average performance of students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So what this basically shows is a national assessment of education progress, and one of the things you'll see here is between 1971 and 2012, the score gaps of 13-year-olds on reading scale scores has closed substantially. And in fact, a lot of the conversation in the 1980s was about, well, why did the sort of closing of the gap stagnate in the late 1980s? But what we've seen increasingly is that those gaps have closed and almost from 44 scale points to 23 for the gap between whites and African Americans in that time period. For Latinos and whites, we can also see closure in these score gaps in reading scale scores. But there still remains a persistent gap in the average achievement of students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And that's one of the things that has driven me to pay a lot of attention to what's actually happening in the context of schools to lead to this. We can also see this in the racial and ethnic differences in GPA. So the National Transcript Study, where they looked at over 38,000 transcripts from 41,000 students in the US and collected in 2009. And what we can see here is that there are gaps between Asian students at the top and white students, a 3.26 GPA average compared to 3.09. And there's a gap between African American and Hispanic students falling below their white and Asian counterparts. And what this in some ways translates to is differences in the educational attainment of folks. So we can see that Asians are more likely to have a bachelor's degree than their white counterparts, and that African American and Hispanics are less likely to have a college degree than their white and Asian counterparts. And one of the reasons, obviously, that this is very important is because, you know, everyone should have access to high quality educational opportunities. Everyone should have access to the opportunities that are provided by graduating from college, or at least having access to enrolling in college and a college degree, but also access to jobs. In 1973, only 28% of jobs required some college as sort of an entry-level requirement, but by 2007, what we see is almost 60% of jobs required some college for getting access to those jobs. And given the sort of demographic shifts in our society, demographic shifts that we experience in places like Seattle, but across the country, this is not a sustainable way for us to go. So the practical implications for me really relate to, you know, the educational opportunities that people have and our demographic shifts. What does it mean for our society if we don't figure out these problems, all right? But I also have some, you know, more intellectual concerns, and those are sort of related to why Amanda and I wrote the book that we did. So a lot of the research on racial achievement gaps talks about race and talks about it as if it's a variable without any deep theoretical analysis of what race actually means. So one question for us is, what's racial about racial achievement gaps? A second thing was, how can we understand how racial inequality gets embedded within school organizational practices and routines? What is it about the daily functioning of schools that reproduces racial inequality in the context of a society where we say we believe in educational equity? Finally, how do these gaps persist in a liberal suburban school district where nearly everyone espouses the best intentions? So I'm going to talk about Riverview, a place where people move to because of the racial diversity. Everyone espouses their sort of liberal, egalitarian beliefs about education and society. It's a blue state that sees itself as supporting racial equity, but these gaps still persist in Riverview. So that becomes a place for us to really understand, even in the best of circumstances, we might say, how do these racial inequalities persist? Theoretically then, I want to start by talking a little bit about race itself, how race is a social construction, and how status beliefs attached to race shape how we interact with each other. We have to understand that race is not something that we can just throw into a regression equation and not, or we can, I mean, people do all the time. But I mean, when we try to understand what's racial about what's happening in our society and our education system, it's important for us to theorize race itself and to understand it and to understand its origins. Racial beliefs have historically been intertwined with ideas about intelligence, with ideas about violence and criminality. And we have to, or from my perspective, it's important to understand that race emerges and becomes sort of a folk theory of how people are biologically, but not biologically, but in our minds biologically, to justify slavery, colonialism, and genocide. And so I'm going to depart from tradition a little bit because I want to show a short clip that I think captures this very well. And if you'll bear with me with regard to this, I think it will be helpful in sort of framing and helping to think about the rest of the talk. So here we go. Can you hear in the back?
All men are created equal. All men are created equal. It's the lofty and revolutionary ideal at America's core. Yet it was written at a time when some inhabitants were held in bondage, and others were being dispossessed of their lands. How did American society justify unequal treatment based on skin color and national origins? How did it reconcile that contradiction? America created a story of race.
Race was never just a matter of how you look. It's about how people assign meaning to how you look.
We have the idea that it's somewhere written in stone that there are these fundamental differences between human beings. We don't realize that race is an idea that evolves over time, that it has a history, that it is constructed by a society to further certain political and economic goals.
Created over 4 centuries, race has become a powerful and enduring narrative. Moments in America's past reveal how this idea took hold and became the lens through which we view our world. Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia slaveholder, penned the revolutionary words proclaiming human equality in the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote a lesser-known, influential document, Notes on the State of Virginia. Written in response to questions from France about the American colonies, the book reads as a kind of sales pitch for America. Notes on the State of Virginia was not about race, but among Jefferson's descriptions of rivers and seaports, mountains and climate, he expressed his views on the inhabitants of the new land, people from America, Europe, and Africa.
I advance it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
It is possible to make the argument that Thomas Jefferson is the first person to truly articulate a theory of race in the United States, and in effect he has to do so. He has said in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. Well, if in fact we're all created equal, and if in fact we're entitled to our liberty, then how can he possibly own 175 slaves and going up to about 225 slaves at the peak of his slaveholding?
In notes, Jefferson's words appeared to justify slavery at a time when many were admonishing the Founding Fathers for espousing freedom, while continuing to support a system of human bondage.
The problem that they had to figure out is, how can we promote liberty, freedom, democracy on the one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of peoples who were non-white on the other?
And the way you do that is to say, yeah, but there's something different about these people. This whole business of inalienable rights, that's fine, but it only applies to certain people.
The moment when we become a nation is critical for our understanding of both American nationality and race. We accept the notion that all men are created equal, but then perhaps some of those people who are enslaved are not quite men. That is, we'll keep our ideas of American nationality, but we'll write certain people out of the human family.
If I get this back, it'll be a miracle. Okay, cool. So basically, good morning, everyone. Going back to Thomas Jefferson. So I think the point here is that, and we can talk about the nature of that statement, all men are created equal, and think about the multiple ways that excludes women, the way that it excludes all non-white people. But what it suggests is that the foundations of how we talk about race are intertwined with ideas about people's status and what that means, right? And so Cecilia Ridgway and some of her colleagues have done a lot of work on the idea of status beliefs, right? They're widely shared cultural beliefs that people who belong to one social or racial social group are more esteemed and competent than those who belong to another group, right? And these ideas about intelligence, morality, criminality that come down from the period when Jefferson is writing actually affect what happens to us today, right? And these status beliefs are ways to construct and justify inequality between categories of people, right? So now we have this discourse about poverty and how people have a culture of poverty. We have ideas about women in science and STEM, that they, even the president of Harvard a few years ago, essentially, and one of President Obama's not cabinet members, one of his advisors, stating that, well, maybe women have this different way of thinking about the world. That sort of justifies the maintenance of control and power by those who want to maintain their potential status, and helps explain away the inequalities that are structurally driven, right? And the ideas haven't gone away. So Larry Bobo and his colleagues have done some work recently that asked whites to compare themselves to African Americans. So these are whites' ratings of the industriousness and intelligence of their own industrious and intelligence in comparison to African Americans. And what we see here is that in 1990 all the way through 2008, whites are more likely to see themselves as more hardworking, and they're more likely to see themselves as more intelligent than African Americans. It doesn't necessarily mean that they tie it to biology, but they do believe that blacks don't work as hard and are not as intelligent as they are. And in fact, when we flip this over and say how many whites believe that blacks are more industrious and intelligent than they are, 6% of whites believe that blacks are more intelligent and 7% believe that blacks are more industrious. But we can see the pattern here. And that reflects itself not just in how people think about intelligence, but how people perceive criminality, right? So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here. What this research did was ask people and essentially compared how people perceive criminal activity committed by African Americans versus the reality of what percentage of African Americans commit those crimes. And the first two columns lay this out in Florida. So this is their belief, the percentage of African Americans who commit violent crimes in Florida was about 47%, and the reality was about 21%, right? The perception here, people who break into homes and businesses in Florida, their belief was over about 43%, the reality was under 30%, right? And those perceptions are not just, in people's heads because they put them there, but they're in people's heads because of the media portrayals, the historical portrayals of criminality, and we can see it in the contemporary context as we talk about the ways in which Muslims are being portrayed in the media as the people who we should fear. And sort of some of the recent statements by Donald Trump and others sort of relate to this, that we wind up being susceptible to these ideas around race, around religion, around gender, around difference as status beliefs that sort of shape how we believe and how we think about people and interact with them. So I want to make that connection because I think it's important for us to pay attention to. And one of the ways that people have really studied this is to think about trying to understand the ways that these biases in our thinking become sort of implicit biases, that we can even unconsciously believe these things before we engage in conscious thought. So I want to move on to talk about the theoretical tools that I'll be using to sort of lay some of the work out. We can think about organizations as functioning through a set of organizational routines. An organizational routine is sort of a repetitive, recognizable pattern of action that people engage in and sort of understand how it's supposed to work. So we had an organizational routine today. Ken introduced me, I came up, I started talking, and I broke it a little bit. I did some different things, but the idea is that if you outline what a presentation looks like, it's kind of it. Someone gets introduced, they come up, they hope, you hope you can stay awake and hear what they're saying. We get to the end and maybe you learn something, right? But the reality is that these kind of routines can be broken down into the sort of ideal of the routine that sort of outlines that basic structure, and the performance of the routine that involves real people interacting in real time. So this talk is different than the last one, and it'll be different from the next one because there are people involved in that engagement and interaction. And what we argue is that the ostensive aspect of organizational routines, or the ideal of the routine, is the routine in its legitimizing form, and that the performance of the routine is how it actually works in practice. So I'll give you an example. In the hiring process in an organization, from the ostensive aspect, we attract applicants, we screen those applicants, and then we hire the most qualified people, right? It's pretty straightforward, and that's how the ideal of it's supposed to work. But in reality, some things get in the way, and one of the ways that status beliefs matter is that people perceive people differently based on their race and ethnic background. So one study had sent out field testers to a number of jobs. They were equally qualified, had the same resumes, and had been trained in interpersonal interaction skills so that they would behave in similar ways. They sent out whites, Latinos, and African Americans in the low-wage labor market, and what they found is that whites were much more likely to get callbacks than Latinos, and Latinos were much more likely to get callbacks than African Americans. So they wanted to test this even further, and what they did is they sent out whites, Latinos, and blacks, and they had the whites with the same resumes as the African Americans and Latinos report that they had a felony conviction. Whites were still more likely to get called back, right? Slightly more likely to get called back than Latinos and African Americans. And what that really tells you is that all this discussion about hiring and merit, runs into problems when people's status comes into play. Similar study sent out identical resumes with African American and white sounding names and found out that those with white sounding names with the exact same resumes as those with African American sounding names got 50% more callbacks than the African Americans did, right? So again, you know, we have this ostensive idea about how these things work, but in their performance, status, beliefs, and ideas come into play and shape how things work. Finally, if we think about only merit being important, I also want to highlight this idea of the forms of capital that people possess. So the other piece of this sort of hiring routine is that, you know, you hire the most qualified people, but what Lauren Rivera found when she looked at firms, law firms, investment banks, and consulting firms, and asked people who had conducted interviews what was the most important criteria that they chose people on, what she found is that in law firms, the percent of people evaluating, evaluators who cited fit as their top criteria for hiring people in law firms was over 70%, in investment banks was over 60%, and in consulting firms was over 30%. So it's not just what people bring to the table. What was more important to people who were hiring in these firms was the fit, how they spend their leisure time, what kind of interaction styles they had, how were they like the people who were hiring them. And we know the disproportionate rates of people who are in these positions of power in making the hiring decisions will reproduce the inequalities in our society. So if we think about this whole process, you attract applicants, you screen applicants, you hire the most qualified applicants. Within all of these processes, status beliefs and different forms of capital play a role. And what we argue in the book is that race itself is critical to understanding how these processes play out in the broader society, and now we're going to sort of switch it to schools. Final theoretical piece is this idea of opportunity hoarding. What opportunity hoarding is the process through which dominant groups who have control over some good, in this case education, regulate its circulation, thus preventing outgroups from having access to it. Charles Tilly has done a lot of this work, and Doug Massey talked about it quite a bit in a book called Categorical Inequality. And when you think about it in the context of education, and I'll talk about African Americans in particular, African Americans were initially excluded from education altogether, right? It was illegal to educate African Americans. We had a Jim Crow period where we had a separate and unequal set of schools that separated African Americans out and provided inferior education, or at least inferior educational resources. Vanessa Siddle Walker and others have talked about how desegregated school contexts were actually often vibrant contexts. My mother's an example of someone who did exceptionally well in a segregated school. And in the contemporary context, that opportunity hoarding can function in a way that people espouse egalitarian beliefs, state universal goals while they're still hoarding opportunity. And so that's the final piece that I'll talk about. So that was a long introduction. Don't get nervous. I think I can, bring it home. So the research. So Amanda and I started this study several years ago. We call it the Suburban School Achievement Study. It's a case study of Riverview, which is a pseudonym for a racially diverse, affluent suburban high school. 171 interviews were conducted with students, teachers, administrators, staff, and parents. There was a survey of 26,000 7th through 11th graders across 15 school districts, including Riverview, from which we draw some of our findings. We looked at community, social, historical, and economic data to try to make sense of this community itself and its historical context. And we had observations in and around the school building. I was housed in the building for a period of time. Amanda visited the building on several occasions. And so we had some sense of the space and how people navigated the space. We wanted to study Riverview because it's an integrated suburb with long-term voluntary integration. It serves a relatively affluent Black and Latino population. And so we wanted to understand race and the implications of race. And part of what we wanted to do is not study an affluent white community and a working class African American Latino community. We wanted to understand what happens in a middle class community, a predominantly middle class community. And as I said before, it presents sort of an opportunity to study a best case scenario, a liberal community that expressed commitment to diversity and voluntarily desegregated. And it reflects the growing demographic reality of Latinos and African American population growth in U.S. suburbs, particularly in major metropolitan areas. So Riverview had this demographic makeup. It was 48% African American, 48% white, 41.3% African American, 8.5% Hispanic, 2.1% Asian, Pacific Islander, and a very small percentage of Native American students. While it was a predominantly middle-class community, white median family income was substantially higher than that of African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans. Home ownership was higher among whites, and the poverty level was not high for any particular group, but those individuals below the poverty line was smaller for whites than for others. The people we interviewed 171 folks, and this is sort of a breakdown of who we talked to. Talked to a large number of students, parents, staff members, and tried to understand how they made sense of this environment. So now I want to move forward to talk about some of what we found. And in doing this, I want to unpack 2 organizational routines and try to bring to light this sort of distinction between the ostensive and performative aspect of these organizational routines as a way that inequality gets embedded in our organizational context, keeping alive this idea about race, status beliefs, and performance expectations. And one more note about this, we know that there are racial disparities in suspension and expulsion. They've been documented for decades, but we were more focused on the formal and informal rules and practices that happen in the context of the school, right? Because they shape how people feel connected to the community, the extent to which they feel like they're full members in the community, and they send powerful messages about who belongs and who doesn't. Beyond that, the large differences in the teacher referral process for minor infractions are what accrue into these big differences in suspension and expulsion rates. So we wanted to get us inside the day-to-day process. And we also think about discipline as a process and not a discrete event. So people get selected into discipline and they get processed through the discipline process, and then there's an outcome. So back to this sort of way of thinking about it. In the discipline routine, there's an ostensive aspect where you're selected in discipline because you break a rule that's in the code of conduct, right? You're processed through this system, and then you receive the appropriate punishment. Either nothing happens, you get punished, you get suspended, or you get expelled from school, right? And this is the way that Mr. James, who was an African-American security guard, talked about it when we initially interviewed him. He said, the discipline handbook, that's our guide. It tells us the discipline rules, it tells us the consequences. We don't care if you're white, black, Hispanic, Russian, Asian, Hebrew, Chinese. We're going to follow that book. And that's just where we are. When I come into this building, I don't see colors, I see people. There are no favors, right? So you sort of see that there's almost this colorblind discourse that emerges from his conversation. Everybody's treated the same, the book is fair. And this sort of supports what Ann Ferguson talks about when she talks about discipline, that this idea of conformity to school rules is treated by school adults as the essential prior condition for any learning to take place. Rules bear the weight of moral authority and are spoken about as inherently neutral, impartially exercised, and impervious to individual feelings and personal responses, right? That's the ostensive aspect captured in what Ann Ferguson is saying. But as we followed up and questioned Mr. James further, he said the following: I don't think the have-nots are always treated the same. I think if your parents can afford lawyers and can talk very loudly and are very educated, you might stand a chance of getting away with something. The have-nots are generally seen as rude, disrespectful, and polite. And they don't generally get away with it because for the most part, the have-nots' parents are not going to come over here and deal with it. And as he talked about the haves and the have-nots, there was the obvious sort of class distinction, but to a large extent, he was talking about a racial distinction as well. So when we talk about discipline, we talk about it in terms of a differential selection, a differential processing, and a differential set of outcomes. That student status and social background influences how they get selected into discipline. That there's differential processing so that parents, school people, respond differently in their interactions with white, affluent parents and black parents who are affluent. There's sort of a difference in how they're processed. And there are differential outcomes based on these different interactions within the performative aspects of the organizational routine. A couple of examples here. Differential selection in practice, the hallway pass. So one of the things that the discipline handbook says is that students who leave the room during period must get a valid pass from a teacher or supervisor. Students without a pass face school consequences, right? Very clearly stated, everyone should be treated the same. This is what happens when you don't have a pass. Everyone needs to have a pass. What we found is that students didn't see it this way. Maria, who's a white sophomore, said, I think security guards point out African Americans a lot more than like white. Like I'll walk down the hall without a pass and they'll just let me go. But then they'll see someone else and they'll say, you have a Saturday detention. I think it's really uncalled for that they don't stop everyone. One of the things that was striking to us is that Black, Latino, and white students recognize that African American students, particularly, and Latino students, and particularly boys, were not treated the same as they moved through the hallways. And if you can think about the accumulation of these daily experiences in the hallway, it reminds me in a lot of ways about the discussion about policing more generally, right? That it has parallels to what's happening outside the school, but it also communicates a certain sense of belonging or not belonging, a certain belief about innocence and guilt that permeates the school building. Another way that this played out was around dress. So schools spend a lot of time trying to regulate how students dress and the way that they wear clothes. And in this case, they spend a lot of time, interestingly, focusing on young women, which actually isn't that surprising. Brief and revealing clothing, it says, are not appropriate in school. Examples include tank and halter tops, garments with spaghetti straps or strapless garments, clothing that is see-through, cut low, or exposes the midriff, or skirts that are shorter than 3 inches above the knee. This comes from the Riverview Discipline Code, and we could spend a lot of time talking about gender, the way that gender and discipline play out, the way that female bodies are characterized and female bodies of color are categorized. But let me just give you a couple examples of how this played itself out. So one Riverview teacher talked about the fact that when this policy was enforced, it wasn't enforced fairly. As she says, we had a policy that girls couldn't have their belly showing. All you saw walking in the halls was girls with their white bellies out, black girls getting sent home. The black girls were pissed off. One black student said, well, why are you saying something to me? I'm sitting here in a room with 6 girls with their stomachs out and you pick me out of the group, right? So again, it's this sort of idea of the discipline code gets stated in this ostensive aspect as very fair, equal, and the way it plays out is not equal. Another way that this plays out is in the processing of discipline, right? So that once someone is identified for discipline, how are they treated in that process? And one student, Julius, talked about what happens when kids get caught with marijuana in the school, as they are often do, or sometimes do. I don't want to characterize the place negatively. So when he says, white kids get caught with pot all the time. The school can't be dealing with those folks' parents because their parents are going to start suing the school. When you get a black kid and you suspend them for having pot or you kick them out, what are the parents going to do? They don't have the money or they don't have the resources. That's why it continuously happens. So we might think, well, Julius is just saying this because he got caught with pot and got suspended, right? Which he didn't. And his parents are both lawyers. So there's a bit of a contradiction in here. But I mean, he's making a broader observation of what's going on. And this is something that I think gets reflected in how administrators talk about the same issue of drug possession. So one Riverview administrator said the following: I have had parents come in and appeal white students' disciplinary actions, and rarely do they say, my son didn't do that, or wouldn't do that, or my daughter would not. The issue is, how will it get put into the record? Can we not call it that because we don't want to impact college admissions? I hear it 20 times a year. A student gets caught in possession of some marijuana. The parent never said to me he didn't have it, he didn't do it. The parent argued that we call it possession, and possession means you have it and it's yours. It's yours to manipulate and to sell. It was never his. He was just looking at it. It was in his hands, so that possession is not real possession, right? So how we see this playing out is how parents sort of try to parlay their resources and their desire to, or their sense of privilege into this process. So I want to shift gears a bit to talk about opportunity hoarding. And I think this is one of the key pieces that we often miss. Our gaze is often placed on the African American and Latino kids in the school. And I recognize that this is very focused on three racial groups, African Americans, Latinos, and whites, and not Asian Americans. And largely that's because our study was focused on a school that only had 2.1% Asian Americans. We could have a whole different and interesting conversation that talks about the interplay between the model minority myth, between ideas about differential outcomes for Asians from different regions, et cetera, et cetera. But that's sort of the focus here for today. So again, opportunity hoarding is the process through which dominant groups who have control over some good regulated circulation. And we know historically that U.S. whites have long hoarded opportunities by establishing school systems that provide no or an inferior education to blacks, Latinos, Native Americans. And what was striking in the interviews is that while people recognize the inequality in the schools, and while they said they love diversity, and while they said they moved to the community because they love diversity and because they liked teaching there because it was a diverse school, they also recognized that opportunity hoarding was one of the phenomena that really shaped the experiences of what they could do as administrators and what was happening in the school. So if we recall, the school is about 48% white and 41.3% African American, 8.5% Latino. But when we look at the honors and AP classes, we see that the AP classes are about 90% white, the honors classes are about 80% white, and the regular level classes are majority African American and Latino. And what the students say about these differences is that the experiences that they had in those classes, in the honors and AP classes when they were there, and in the regular classes were very different. So one student, a black female student named Kim, said, when I moved down from honors to my regular, I didn't know how far back I was actually going. I just kind of got frustrated because it was so easy. Like you find yourself doing bad because it's so easy. You don't try. And it's boring and it's frustrating. And this school is kind of backwards because the really good teachers are in the honors and AP teachers and the bad teachers are the regulars. And it seems like it should be the opposite, right? But what happens in most of the school districts where I talk to people about how people get placed is a process called teacher tracking. So you're not only putting kids in a privileged position with more rigorous curriculum, but you're giving them the teachers who are, by certain measures, more prepared to teach them well, right? So it's matching the more experienced teachers with the best training with the students who have performed well historically. And so not only do we see this sort of tracking process happening, we see it happening in ways that people come to conflate class level with race. So Julius talks about it this way. The fact is Riverview is two schools in one. There's the honors white school and then there's the other school. And Richard goes a step further. Richard is a white, high-achieving white sophomore. He says, I mean, if you look at the numbers, I'm betting there are more white kids in the honors classes and more black kids that are in minority classes, right? So the lower level classes, the regular classes have even come to be called minority classes, right? And what this sort of reflects is how people begin to see and continue this sort of long history of thinking about race and intellectual ability together. So Gabe says, I guess I'm white, so I'm expected, I guess, to be smarter. Usually, when someone sees me, they always think I'm smarter than most people. I think that usually the perception is that black people are dumber than white people and Hispanics are not as smart as everyone else, right? Sort of matter-of-factly stating that. And it's interesting because if we think about race as sort of a relational phenomenon, what it becomes is that Gabe probably does better in his classes because everybody thinks he's supposed to do well. Not only because he feels confident, because he gets this message reinforced every day, but also because people probably give him better grades because he's a white kid, right? And this is something that is sort of reflected in the ways that people talk about it at Riverview, right? One of the things that was critical is that they talked about the discipline practices in the honors and AP classes were much more lax than they were in the regular classes, and that it was almost impossible to give someone a grade that wasn't a B or higher in the AP and honors classes because of the external pressure that they get from parents saying, well, my kid's got to go to college and that wasn't really possession and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So parents also believed that these classes were very different and the tracks were very different. So while the parents wanted an integrated experience, they talked about the school in the following ways. You know, I think it's an excellent high school, especially for kids who are in the honors program or in AP classes. With our daughter, who's now entering this fall, after a debate with her about whether to send her to Riverview or a private school, we told her that If you can't get into honors, can't attain the grades, you're out of Riverview, right? So I don't know if that's familiar to, okay, I didn't see anybody's head nodding. It was like, is this off-putting?
It's very familiar.
I wonder, okay, thank you. All right,
I'm speaking
it's familiar to, okay.
a lot of the things you're saying are very familiar.
Okay, so, yeah, so I break conventions sometimes. It's like, so, and so white parents talked about these differences in course level. Janet said, I think as an honor student, I think the school certainly is set up to benefit her. And I don't know, I really don't feel that I can speak to what kind of resources are being invested in other kids, right? So we think about this idea of my kid versus other kids, and I'm looking out for mine. And this in some ways is the essence of opportunity hoarding. It feels like accumulation of individual decisions that become systems that hoard opportunity for certain people. It's the day-to-day functioning of interactions because, yeah, so I'll come back to that. So one of the ironies in this, and one of the things that parents were trying to sort out, was this desire for integration and the realization that the schools, once they got inside school and inside classrooms, that it wasn't very diverse inside the classroom. So the school was diverse. People gathered in the hallways and they moved through the hallways sometimes together. They actually had kind of separate cafeterias where people hung out, which you expect from sort of social, how people interact with each other, but the classrooms were very separate. So people talked about being able to walk down the hallway and know the honors and AP classes as opposed to the regular level classes. So white parents talk about valuing diversity. So Mindy talks about it this way. So we said, oh, so you moved here for the schools? Yeah, because we almost bought a house in another suburb, but we were just like, ugh, can't do it. And they laughed. And we said, what about it? It was just all white bread, all wealthy, no exposure. It's just everybody is privileged and entitled. It's like, oh, no. So you moved to Riverview partly because of the diversity in the schools. Yeah, I love that, yeah. And that was a pretty common way that people talked about it. And in fact, there was sort of a competition between this community and a neighboring community. And that competition was essentially, Riverview is the diverse community where we believe in equality, and you're the white bread community, but you're our biggest rival, and we're gonna show you that we're better because we're more diverse. And that was part of the sort of ethos of this community. It wasn't always explicitly stated that way, but there was definitely a belief in equity, diversity, and inclusion in the broader discourse in the community. But that commitment to diversity seemed to be pretty shallow because parents could see that their kids were going to different classes. I'm talking about white parents in particular. As Jack said, it's not like I'm roaming the hallways during school hours, but I suspect that most of the honors classes are mostly white and Asian kids, and those are the classes that he's in. Another parent, Timothy, who's a middle-class white parent, said their honors and AP classes, the classes his kids takes, there were not many kids who were Hispanic or African American in those classes. So they recognized that their kids are being resegregated in the context of the school, as Roz Mickelson sort of talks about this second generation segregation, but they did not necessarily want to change it. So we talked to another parent who had the following to say, when we asked him, what would you change in the school? He said, what would I change? There are people who would change the leveling system. I would not. I would attempt to figure out a way to make the boundaries. I don't know what I'm trying to say there. And so what would you do? I know there are parents who are great proponents of just no leveling, but sorry, I don't want my kid to sit in a class of 30 and have it be a waste of their time. I just don't, I've been there. I don't know what I would change, to be honest. It's a pretty good institution, but my children are all in the honors level, right? So one of the other things that happened in this school, and I'm mindful of the time, so I think we have, oh, okay. I can prattle on for, it won't be too much longer, I promise. So one of the things that was interesting, though, that as they tried to make changes to the policies, one of the things they tried to do in Riverview was to create a process where parents could sort of intervene in the selection of their kids for honors and AP classes. So they had a process where you got into AP classes by teacher recommendations, grades, and test scores, but they felt that if they opened it up to parents being able to advocate and get their kids in, it would create more diversity in the classrooms, right? The opposite happened, right? And so what one administrator said to us is, I think that school policymakers have created a monster, and a monster which supports the academic achievement gap by allowing parents to have the final say. What happens is a lot of times, white parents put their kids in the honors classes, they don't do well, or as well as they want. They're getting C's and they're paying the ones who can pay big bucks for tutors to teach their kids the whole time. For what, right? And as they tried another process, which was to reduce the number of course levels and create more mixed level classes and more classes where you had regular level kids and honors level kids together, they ran into more efforts to hoard opportunity on the part of parents. So one administrator talked about this when they were trying to create more mixed level classes. He said, I counted them at one point. I attended over 200 meetings with parents of kids to talk about the standards and the fact that we needed common standards for all kids, not different standards for different kids. And to reassure people that our high-end kids this was not about dumbing down the curriculum, right? So this discourse becomes, how can we protect these exclusive spaces for our own kids? As they were able to reduce the number of course levels and create more mixed level classes, another process happened, which we called internal white flight. So they had this whole idea of creating in the humanities and particularly in the social studies courses more opportunities for mixed level classes, because the research says that mixed level classes and classes that are more diverse, actually not mixed level, but more diverse classes are really better for learning social studies, right? And so they said, let's mix these classes up. There will be richer experiences. This is the diversity you want. What they found, one history teacher told us, is the whole idea of having mixed classes across the board reflecting the mix of the school. One issue which I don't think gets talked about much is white flight, for lack of a better term. When the U.S. history team classes were created, I think there was a movement of some kids, white kids, into American studies because that was perceived as a safe space to be for whatever reason. And in some cases, I'm not sure they're even conscious of it, right? So there was a migration of whites into spaces where they didn't see as many African American and Latinos. And another history teacher talks about it this way, in more explicit terms. Many of our honors kids that I had as a freshman had parents who strong-armed them, white kids, into studying Russian history. And they said, well, Mommy, I have no interest in Russian history. I want to study Africa. They say, you're taking Russian. Or, Mommy, I have no interest in the Middle East. You're taking Middle East. And those classes have become largely white honors, Russian and Middle East, right? So there's a perception that parents were sort of even migrating within the restructured social studies program to create more exclusively white spaces for their kids. Another piece that was really critical to reinforcing this inequality in the context of the school and institutionalize the advantage was grade weights. So the honors and AP classes actually weighted grades so that when you're in those honors and AP classes, you got a 0.5 increase for honors and a whole point increase for AP. So I read applications for Northwestern one year, and it's like, why do all these kids have 5.2 GPAs or whatever, in a 4-point scale? But this grade weight, right? And it becomes important, like a 4.0 isn't good enough anymore. So institutionalizing advantage around tracking and the use of grade weights was another issue. And one of the administrators entered the conversation by talking about his experience of understanding that a lot of the white kids were benefiting from this disproportionately because they were more likely to be in the honors and advanced placement classes. And so he said, I remember when Mr. Weber, when minority student achievement first became a real focus in the 1990s, he was showing me the distribution of grades based on race. And the thing that shocked me was the grades of the white students. There were a number of kids who were getting A's and B's that really, I don't think, were operating at what I would consider an A or B level. Part of the achievement gap is going to be exacerbated by the weighted grade system. So you can think about the distribution of students across courses, the grade weights, and how that might have implications. In addition to the fact that many people told us that they were much less likely to get anything lower than a B in those honors and AP classes because they were honors and AP students, right? And one teacher talked about this. When we asked her what kind of things would you change, she thought about the idea of grade weights, but then she said some changes are just too much for the district to take. I would love to do away with weighted grades, but I think people would just die, right? So one of the things that we, thought about was, sort of this ostensive aspect of thinking about how people get placed in these classes, and that student selection, that students are placed on the appropriate track based on their academic performance, that they receive appropriate instruction based on their academic needs, and that students' outcomes are enhanced by the appropriate instructional experiences. Again, we think that status intervenes in this, and particularly race and potentially social class, that student social status, the expectations of staff members, and parent intervention influence who gets selected into these classes. That they're differentially processed because there's unequal educational resources distributed across these course levels, which means that the kids who are in the honors and AP classes are getting more experienced teachers, are getting more rigorous instructional practice, and they're actually going to get differential outcomes based on that. One of the things that was striking as well is that African American and white parents had very different narratives about how the school responded to them when they tried to intervene. So while white parents were more likely to intervene, African American parents who tried to intervene were much more likely to get resistance. The white parents talked about it as, oh, they were great, the science chair was wonderful, the teacher responded right away. African American parents often characterize this as a fight from the beginning, right? And that there was a tension in how people responded to. So, how do we think about reducing these kinds of inequalities? Well, one of the ways that Riverview has tried to do this is by reducing the number of course levels that students are offered. Even though they got this resistance, this internal white flight, these threats of people leaving the district, they moved from a 5-level system to a 3-level system with mixed level courses to an earned honors sort of structure. And what the earned honors structure means is that what they tried to do is revise portions of the honors curriculum so that students actually had to earn their honors credit. Before, what wound up happening is people tested into honors or got placed into honors, and then they could kind of coast and get the honors credit in the grade weight. What they found is that if they ratcheted up the expectations, and they actually used the Common Core standards as one way to think about the curricular changes they wanted to make, they were able to increase the number of students who had access to honors curriculum because they put all but about 15% of students in these courses where they could earn honors credit. And they assigned honors credit only by students doing the level of work that earned them the honors credit. One of the arguments that they made is that a lot of times, because of the structure of the classes, students felt like that wasn't a space for them, that honors wasn't something they could do. But by seeing that the honors kids maybe weren't, getting honors credit didn't necessarily require them to do things they weren't able to do, they were able to substantially increase the number of students who actually earned honors credit. One of the tricky things, though, is as they engage in this process, they had to very carefully study the process. So there's an economist working with the school to sort of study it rigorously. I mean, not that economists are the only rigorous folks, but to study this very carefully and to share information with the school board and those parent groups that are very vocal to say this isn't hurting people. In fact, it's helping to broaden the experiences of people, and it's not hurting the top-end students, right? So even in trying to create more opportunity, there's always this interplay between how people are trying to hoard opportunity and how you sort of respond to those opportunities. Another process that I'm engaged in is work that I'm doing with the University of Wisconsin-Madison with the Madison Public Schools. We've created a partnership called Forward Madison, which is a partnership between the School of Education and the school system in Madison. And the key components of this are to try to address issues of race and equity in the school system by thinking hard about how do we enhance the capacity of incoming principals, incoming teachers, and coaches in the school district. So I've been working on this project for the last 2 years. My colleague Gloria Latson-Billings is working as a faculty lead with me on this project. And we've created design teams between the school district and UW with people who understand teacher induction processes, teacher coaching processes, and what is the best way to engage people in professional learning communities, people who understand how to induct and mentor principals to enhance their ability to grow as school leaders and create the conditions for teachers to improve. And we've also engaged in work to try to diversify the teaching force. So in addition to the work we're doing with principals and teachers and the coaches, we've actually created a situation where we're trying to enhance the diversity of the teaching force, both through a pipeline project and through reviving and revising the sort of practices in hiring in the district. A core piece of the induction process is focused on race and equity work. So I've used this book in particular and some of the work that we've done to help people begin to unpack the organizational routines that exist in their schools and understand how those routines themselves can reinforce inequality and how to restructure those routines to pay more attention to the implications that they have for race and equity issues. It's been energizing work and engaging work, but it's also been challenging work. But one of the key ideas here is that how do we create partnerships between universities and school districts that can enhance what's happening on both sides? How do we bring to bear the knowledge that exists on both sides of this traditional divide in ways that enhance teacher learning, what we learn as researchers, and engage in this process? And our hope is that as we continue to do this work, that we feed back the learning that we've gotten from particularly the teacher induction processes and the leader induction processes to our training programs, so that we're trying to use what we're learning through these induction processes to feed back into what's happening in teacher education, what's happening in my department in education leadership and policy analysis. And so there's a way in which there's a hope that, you know, the sort of collection of the expertise from people who are in practice and in research can come together in ways that are powerful and help enhance educational outcomes. So just by way of conclusion, and then we can, you know, probably talk quite a bit more in our conversation, is that what we wanted to accomplish in this book was to make the case that taking race seriously means considering the multiple ways it is implicated in shaping students' educational experiences. We argue that examining the performance of organizational routines, those day-to-day activities and practices that we engage in ways that pay attention to the ways that social status shapes how those routines are practiced, is important to understanding how inequality gets reinforced. But it's also important to understanding how we interrupt those processes, right? We argue that we've paid insufficient attention to this process of opportunity hoarding, that the focus has often been too much on what's wrong with African American and Latino folks and their parents and their communities, ignoring the resources and the vitality that exists and the desire for education, and not paying attention to the other side of the equation, right? How we've always focused, we should focus more of our attention on how opportunity hoarding shapes these processes. And as I said before, the functioning of organizational routines can contribute to the reproduction of inequality, but interrupting those processes and using those processes and understanding of those processes to diagnose and design new routines is a powerful way to make educational change. So I'll stop there, and it looks like we got plenty of time for sort of engagement and discussion. So, thank you.